Welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by Emmy award-winning investigative journalists, Earthfiles reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe, and world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Rendlesham Bentwaters incident, John Burroughs. And now, leading off tonight's program, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
Dan Eugene Willis joined the United States Navy on February 9, 1968. He was 19 years old. His father had been a career Marine during World War II and the Korean War. Dan Willis was assigned to the Naval Communications Station in San Francisco as a high-speed code and teletype operator. He ended up in charge of the code room with a top-secret crypto level 14 clearance with extra sensitive materials. And in 1968 to 69, Navcom in San Francisco was the busiest military command facility in the world. While on watch one day, he heard a ship calling the station with an incoming secret priority message from the coast of Alaska. It was addressed to the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, D.C. And as he decoded the message, Dan was astounded to read that the naval crew visually witnessed off the port bow of their ship, quote, a brightly glowing, reddish-orange, elliptical, unidentified object, approximately 70 feet in diameter. It emerged out of the ocean and immediately shot straight up into space. The object was tracked on ship's radar to be traveling at an estimated 7,000 miles an hour, close quote. Dan Willis ripped the astounding message off the typewriter and later looked through San Francisco newspapers for more reporting from Alaska. But there was no news at all about the phenomenon. That UFO, like so many others since World War II, would be reported only on highly classified and restricted communication channels. The American and world public were never to know. And that bothered Dan Willis. Why was the government keeping gravity-defying UFOs so secret? And how were they blacking out the media? His military career continued with combat in Vietnam through 1970. And then he was honorably discharged from the Navy on May 21st, 1971. 6 years later, in 1977, Dan was living in San Diego, California, and working at the Naval Electronic Systems Engineering Center. He was taking a nap when he found himself on board a craft where he could vividly see small, childlike beings that gave the sense of wise old men working at a control panel. He told me, quote, one of those beings made me start spinning faster and faster until I could not handle it. Then I went through a portal on top of a mountain covered with springtime flowers. I could hear flute music, and I felt euphoric. That scene began to flicker into an old-time movie theater, showing a movie about the journey of a mystic. And I felt strongly that I was being shown that my life on Earth was a projected virtual reality, like the light on the movie screen, close quote. That was followed by another profound experience in a life regression in which Dan felt Kundalini energy going through his hands and feet. With his eyes closed, he saw a gray non-human that emitted intense energy from its large, loving eyes and head. The being projected into Dan's mind a six-pointed star inside a sphere. Then came rapid downloads of sacred geometry patterns and the revelation that like platonic solids, the patterns that Dan was being shown all fit inside each other. A third profound encounter was with IBM scientist Marcel Vogel in 1984 as he was retiring from IBM's San Jose Research Center. Early in Vogel's chemistry and physics career, he became interested in substances that emitted light without heat, that he called conscious crystals. After Vogel's IBM retirement in 1984, Dan Willis helped him set up a laboratory, and Dan worked as a research assistant. Vogel also took an interest in physical evidence from UFOs and investigated a metal sample that allegedly was given to Austrian farmer Billy Meier by blonde-haired extraterrestrials in the 1970s. Vogel said that the metal contained the element thulium, but it mysteriously disappeared from his lab. Well, back around 1985, I had a phone conversation with Marcel Vogel about allegedly pure magnesium isotope 26 found in a UFO crash on a beach in Ubatuba, Sao Paulo, Brazil. Vogel also told me then that the 1970s Billy Meier thulium metal sample that he studied and kept safely in his billfold disappeared without explanation. He told me he thought that somehow extraterrestrials were able to retrieve their non-human metallic evidence from human containers. In the 1970s, Dan Willis went back to college and worked for the Naval Electronic Engineering Center monitoring satellites from 1971 to 1984. And then in 2000, when there was the first gathering of military and other whistleblowers to speak on the record about their knowledge of UFOs at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., Dan Willis was in that group. He reported his own firsthand knowledge about the 1969 secret priority message about the UFO off the coast of Alaska rising straight up out of the ocean at 7,000 miles an hour. Dan Willis would also come to learn about a highly classified project that helped answer one of Dan's questions. How do U.S. intelligence and military authorities keep such a tight lid on the UFO secret? After this short commercial break, Dan Willis will join Phenomenon Radio to share his insights about an alien presence interacting with Earth and what he learned about a project called Mockingbird.
You're listening to Phenomenon Radio live exclusively on KGRAradio.com with Linda Moulton Howe and John Burroughs. Tonight's very special guest, former Navy third-class petty officer radio man Dan Willis, will join the show right after this break. Don't go anywhere.
I'm home.
You're late, mister.
I know. I totally lost track of time watching UFO TV at Bob's. Bob went to Amazon Prime, typed in one word, 5 letters, UFO TV, and then bam, this huge selection of movies popped up. UFOs, Forbidden Archaeology, Suppressed Science, Nikola Tesla, David Icke, and they add new films every week.
I guess that means we're getting UFO TV.
UFO TV is now streaming on Amazon Prime. Look for new films every week. Limited releases also on iTunes.
It's AJ from Vibes, Mind, Body, Spirit. Have you been searching for unique items to create or add to your sacred space? What about tools for your holistic healing? Or those one-of-a-kind magical ingredients to manifest your desires? Well, look no more, because Vibes has a variety of items to assist you in your spiritual journey. From crystals to candles, incense to books, tapestries to jewelry, OnlineVibes.com has what you're seeking. We even have some thoughtful and mindful gifts to share with your friends and family family too. Visit us at onlinevibes.com from the comfort of your home or give us a call at 385-244-1099 to have your order beautifully packaged and sent directly to you or a loved one. And right now, take advantage of the coupon code KGRA at checkout to receive 15% off any order. Remember, online, VIBEC.com.
Now you have the inside contact for alternative talk radio. The Planet. KGRAradio.com.
Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio Live, exclusively on KGRAradio.com. Thank you all for joining us, everyone. To start tonight's interview, here's the one and only Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Thanks, Race. And Dan Willis, welcome to Phenomenon Radio with John Burroughs and me.
Oh, it's so great to be on your show, Linda. I'm a big fan of yours, and I think it's great getting this information out. We had some mutual friendship here with Dr. Marcel Vogel in the past, which is kind of unique.
Yeah, and we will get into that. You have such a complex, braided life relationship from your teen years all the way up to now with this big, huge mystery of phenomena on this planet that our government has called an alien presence for decades. And what I hope that we could do today, because there will be many people in the audience that will not have heard from you firsthand about what happened when you were in San Francisco and you were at Navcom, and you are getting a senior priority message. Set the stage for everybody about what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and unfold that whole episode.
It's a small fragment of the big picture. I'm just one of hundreds of witnesses. But what happened was when I was on watch, monitoring about 8 ship-to-shore circuits. I was a high-speed certified code operator, and I was listening to the call sign. A ship off the coast of Alaska came in, and they came in with a secret priority message going to Chief Naval Operations, Washington, D.C. They were reporting that they visually...
Code, right? It's a beeping in Morse code.
Yeah. They were calling the station, which was NPG, that type of thing,
right.
And I had to, type it on a type. This primitive communications, you have to understand. This is 1969. I was like 20 years old, and it's used when the teletype crypto circuits aren't getting because of atmospheric conditions, they use Morse code, which is reliable. It gets through the noise. And so they must have had a situation where they couldn't get reliable communication, so they had to use the backup channel. And so anyway, the crew witnessed this USO that was turning into a UFO, unidentified submerged object that was about 70 feet in diameter, glowing reddish orange, and shot straight up. The radar operator tracked the blips and estimated it going in excess of about 7,000 miles per hour. I
saw that. When you are now transcribing from that Morse code and those beeps, and you, with your mind and eye, see 7,000 miles an hour straight up from the ocean, what went through your mind?
I took thousands of messages, secret, top secret, through the 2 years that I worked there. It was the busiest communication hub on the planet back in 1969. I couldn't believe what I was typing, what I was writing. I was like, I'm decoding the code, right? And I'm typing this out, and I'm seeing this, and I remember taking it off. I had to give the message to the communications watch officer, and the thought slipped through my mind briefly that I thought, I should take this to a Xerox machine and copy this. This is really interesting. But then I realized, of course, I would it's a hefty prison sentence, if you get caught with something like that. So I just remember as many details as I could about the message. It kind of burned an image in the back of my head when I wrote it out.
Were you able to ask anybody in like higher authority, what does this mean? What could be 70 feet in diameter, red, orange, glowing? This is a UFO shooting out of the ocean at 7,000 miles an hour. Were you able to have any kind of a discussion with anyone?
When you have a high security clearance and you're dealing in that type of thing, we all had little colored badges that were magnetic, allow you into different rooms and everything. You don't really discuss the content of messages with anyone. It just you just do your job. You take it and you give it to the communications watch officer, which they in turn, go on the teletype circuit over to Washington D.C. and that's the last you hear of it. You don't ask, wow, look at this,
And get into real trouble if you did write, which goes to the heart of one of those questions that you've had ever since 1969. Why is the government of the United States and other governments of the world keeping UFOs so secret when they are clearly monitored by military radar? They are seen by military eyewitnesses and other authorities. It is a phenomena that has been with us for millennia, but especially since World War II. And with that, when you thought maybe you could find something out in the media in San Francisco, talk about that process and how that links into the rest of your life trying to understand what the heck is going on with all this secrecy.
Well, when I got the report, I did check the San Francisco Chronicle and, just checked. I scanned through the newspaper. I said, wow, this is like, the only... this is 1969 again. The only thing I could imagine for something that's 70 feet in diameter and glowing and going 7,000 miles per hour, that's an official, authenticated, classified report, is, God, that must be something from the extraterrestrial. I couldn't imagine that here on Earth, where we're guzzling gasoline and, all these primitive technologies, that anyone on Earth had technologies like that.
Okay, and you couldn't find anything in any of the San Francisco media?
No, it stuck with me for decades. I did have some UFO encounters through my life. When I left my government job, I was up in the mountains with my brother, and one flew 100 feet over us. It was about a 50-foot disc. And so it kind of took it out of the realm of speculation. I used to think people saw UFOs, they just want to be important, they're just making up stories or something, But when you see one firsthand, it changes your perspective.
And before we get into some of the discoveries about how our government has managed to keep this secret and perhaps why, let's go into some of that fabric in your own life. There, you have written about, and we talked about in a pre-interview, of your having this extraordinary experience of finding yourself. I don't know if you were at work or at home, but finding yourself in this vivid other reality in a craft. Can you set the stage with what was happening and then unfold what you will say experienced?
Yeah, this was an interesting experience. There's a lot more to this story, but this wasn't a physical, like, you walk up and shake an extraterrestrial's hand or anything of that nature. But it was around 1976, 77, where I, what it felt like, Linda, was these beings were teaching me something. And the first experience with the spinning effect that was intense, and I couldn't handle it. I said to myself within, I can't handle it at this level. I turned this over to my higher self. And then all of a sudden it was like I was in not only a different reality, but a different consciousness. I was in a euphoric state of this incredible reality that appeared to start flickering and pulsing. And what they were conveying as they projected me into this movie theater, like an old-time 1920s, where the projector would go like that, and you could actually see the pulsations in the movie. It was showing that our reality is, this was new concepts to me back in 1976, that reality is actually a projection of our consciousness. And the other experience with the Kundalini that was very extremely intense. I had felt like millions of volts going through my hands and my feet with this being with a large cranium and loving eyes and intense energy, to put it mildly, as he projected in space a sphere. Within the sphere, I saw what looked like a star tetrahedron, sort of a six-pointed star configuration. Another geometry fit in that one, another one into that one, and it went into infinity, and then it turned back into the sphere. Now, keep in mind, I had no knowledge. I never took in high school geometry. I didn't know what platonic solids were. I didn't realize geometries fit one within the other like that. And what the being was conveying is that in actuality, all of us are like a sphere which contains all the harmonics and all the frequencies, and that at any particular level of our evolution, that we're at a particular vibrational geometry of awareness that can be aware of the sublevels. This was like a high-speed download, and so it gave me a burning desire. What the being was conveying was that through love, we encompass the next higher geometry. It goes into the next higher frequency, and this left a burning desire to find everything I could about geometry, every book I could grab a hold of, and everything in 1976, 77 area. This what led me to. I heard about Dr. Marcel Vogel and about the research work that he was doing with quartz crystals, which apparently this whole alien download, you could say, about geometry and consciousness seemed to have a key in understanding the interface between mind and this substance, this clear rock called quartz. And water as well. And so Marcel was working for IBM still at the time, and I drove up in the middle of a storm, actually, from San Diego up to San Jose. And then in the evening, I knocked on the door, and he welcomed me in, and he was this doctor sitting on the couch, and I was... he turned off the lights and played this classical music, which seemed like, for 20 minutes or a half an hour or something like that. And then he was fascinated to know why I was there and everything. And I told him, I'm fascinated about your work, about what you're doing. And he had a knock on the door. A woman had heard about the procedures he was doing. He was working with these medical doctors in the Bay Area, and he was perfecting a method of cohering thoughts through cutting the quartz crystals in specific geometries. Marcel always used to say that these technologies that he's diving into were akin to those in the known laws of physics. So what he was doing was cohering thought with the crystals cut in such a way as to project the energies of mind through it. And this woman brought this daughter.
Dan, let me just ask you, do you mean enhancing telepathic thought?
Very well, it makes sense that it very well could be. But, what happened was this daughter had a tumor that was sticking out about a half an inch on her ankle, and this doctor sitting on the couch with me watched as he did the procedure, which involved using the breath along with the crystal and a special procedure that he did, and it actually, in front of our eyes, he dematerialized it. It actually went away, and so I became aware that, wow, this man has tapped into an understanding of how to interface consciousness in with matter. In other words, the 3D world that we live in appears to be like a hologram, and that if you go in at a higher structural level and remove the discordant program, all of a sudden the 3D reality, the physical reality that we touch and we feel is solid, can be physically transformed. And he's worked with 24 medical doctors and had incredible success. He cut one of these crystals as a gift for me because I went to the mines in Arkansas where Race used to live, and we were cutting. I wasn't personally cutting. I was more of the research. As I was working with the Naval Electronic Engineering Center, I was able to acquire, spectrophotometers and different types of laboratory equipment. IBM gave him the electron microscope that he put together from scratch, and so we set up this whole laboratory to measure these effects, and we had some very substantiating measurements that show that these energies of mine are real. And this is way before Dr. Emoto's work, where the conscious mind can affect the crystallization process in water.
Well, Dan, my discussion with Marcel Vogel back in the 80s was in the context specifically of UFOs, entities, and the retrieval of technology when we were talking about the metal evidence, and he was talking about how one of the pieces of metal that had been sent to him from Billy Meyer in Austria, the huge Billy Meyer Saga, allegedly was interaction with tall Nordic-looking extraterrestrial beings, as they describe themselves, and that Billy Meyer, had some metal, and that Marcel Vogel was talking to me about it and said that it had been in his own personal billfold and that he knew exactly where it was. He kept it always in a little package in his billfold, and that one day it disappeared from his billfold without explanation. You told me something very interesting.
Yeah, I actually handled those samples. There were crystal metal samples from the Myers case, and that he showed me the little container that he had it in, which still had the indentations of the samples there, but the samples, disappeared. So that's kind of interesting.
Well, and does it fit directly into his conscious crystals, UFO technologies, going back to the idea that we still, on this planet, in the general civilization, are not realizing that every single thing is relating to frequency, and that the frequency that is related to a facet on the crystal, on the angle of the form of a crystal, may be one of the ways that non-humans would program, for example, self-activating software in craft. And this then goes back to that experience where you were taking a nap and then you found yourself inside of that craft. What to me is such a fascinating, kind of unexpected detail is that you were looking at beings that you thought reminded you of small children, and yet they conveyed the deep sense of wise old men.
Yeah, it holds a key to understanding the molecular angles and the tetrahedral hexagonal structures in both water and quartz. By the way, people can look at my notes on marcelvogel.org, and you can see the research, physical measurements. One thing we found that was kind of interesting was that there was, I call it an angular harmonic resonance that happens between quartz and water. you'll notice that, when a quartz crystal grows, it has a specific angle. That angle is like a 52-degree angle, the same exact angle that's on the Great Pyramid in Egypt, which relates to phi mathematics that go into infinity. There's a definite relationship of the geometry that's within water and quartz having to link into this matrix which consciousness interfaces with. One of the interesting things is that, when they dug deep ice core samples down in Antarctica, they found that in water, all the 7 major classes of geometry are described. In other words, water is like a universally resonant form. And Marcel was able to, as we talked earlier, he had a winery that he was able to take the essence of this vibrational essence of this fine wine and store it within a crystal, which he had the wine circle 7 right-hand turns around, and it turned it into a California award-winning wine. But we're trying to get more funding through different commercial products, but some things just didn't fly. But one of the major projects I worked on was the Delaware camera with Marcel, which was incredibly fascinating and completely substantiates the reality that we are living in a holographic world. This thing was made back in the 1950s in England, and we had it imported in. It stood about 5.5 feet tall. It was patented by the European Patent Office. And George Delaware was able to take tens of thousands of photographs. The person could be on the other side of the planet, and they could take a photo of that person using a witness, like a drop of blood or hair or some type of, in other words, every single being has a resonant frequency, you could say, within their DNA, and was able to tune into that. And thing that was interesting about this one device is that it had a time spiral that could go backwards and forwards in the time, that Delaware was able to take photos into the future and into the past. Anyway, my job with that, working with 2 other scientists on this, was to try to bring it up to current, this was 1980s, right, current technology, and be able to reproduce this instrument.
Well, kind of in a big picture way, it seems like we'll call them the physical containers that look like small children, but had the aura of these immensely profound, deep, wise old men, that it kind of started in an arc for you with that experience, because you were being shown that your reality was like the light that was being cast in the old movie theater, and you were having that euphoric feeling. And then the next experience that you had went in to all of these Platonic solids and other geometric patterns in relationship to frequency, all seemingly communicated to you for a reason from another intelligence that wasn't human.
It validated itself to me because I had no prior knowledge of this, and then I was looking at it and I was like, oh my God, the dodecahedron, the icosahedron, and the hexahedron, they all fit perfectly within each other at their points, and that's exactly what the being was conveying, and I had no prior knowledge of this, so it kind of conveyed that there was, this wasn't just something out of my imagination, and the fact that I had millions of volts of kundalini going through my hands and feet, because I remember writing in a diary afterward, because the experience was so bizarre that I thought, I did experience this, I wrote to myself, because, years go by and you said, did that really happen? Type of thing.
Well, if you were trying to explain, let's say, to a high school class, what those 2 experiences, the one with the small non-humans but that they were casting, or they were in a form that didn't match the profoundness of their knowledge and perhaps how long they had lived, and then the geometric patterns that could fit inside of each other, and the moving, the euphoric experience in the springtime flowers on top of the mountain that changed into the old movie theater with the light casting the images on the screen. If you were taking all of that and saying to a high school class what you have learned about us, humans on Earth in this cosmos, what would you say?
Well, after that experience, many decades later, if you study quantum physics, double slit experiments, you start looking at all the science that indicates that we do affect, the observer does affect the experiment. And the fact that, if you look at Marcel was ahead of his time, as you know, and the fact that the elements of SiO2, quartz, and H2O, water, have a secret key into understanding the geometry of the interface between consciousness and matter. Anyway, it's that's why you have cultures that are far removed, and not only in different parts on the planet, but in time as well, that have these reverences toward, these crystals and gems and stuff like that. And they all are similar. There's it's a science of the future that we're seeing some indicators that there is something special that interfaces with consciousness. Could the process of baptism, the dipping an entire human body underwater for a period of time and releasing, could that baptism process be related to frequencies and crystal angles of water? No question about it. When you look at what water, water is so extremely sensitive. I mean, you can just be in the room with the water and it'll affect its patterning. It has this dipole molecule that's just on this very, very sensitive teeter-totter that it basically mirrors its environment. So if you're doing some type, and there's, all through cultures, they have all sorts of high priests in different religions and different across history that have used water in their ceremonies. But absolutely. Well, do you think that you have been deliberately communicated with, educated by non-humans for a specific reason? I have no idea. I'm still trying to figure all this out. The thing that really got to me, Linda, was after testifying, each one of us stated we'd be willing to testify under oath before Congress. That's penalty of perjury. 20 of us were willing to go before the 22 cameras in the back row of the National Press Club. And, being an ex-ABC newsman, I used to be a broadcast engineer for the most powerful FM station on the West Coast. When I heard about, all of the, oh my God, there was that we have the technology to get off of nuclear, oil, and coal, that we've had anti-gravity craft since the 1950s, that there's bases on the other side of the moon, that the astronauts have been told to keep secret what happened when they went to the moon back in 1969, that, by 1989 they had 57 different species already categorized, and then nukes being shut down, all this stuff. Any of that would get out into the mainstream public's mind. I couldn't imagine how this could not be a world-changing event. And not only was there 20 witnesses, but there was like 450 behind that. And the reason why this event back in May 9th, 2001 occurred was because ever since Eisenhower, our legal constitutional republic government has been denied access. If you look back at what happened, Eisenhower was kind of forced into creating a new MJ-12 group. They moved all their reverse engineering operations from Wright-Patterson over to Area 51. That's 4. You've got Nelson Rockefeller restructured the entire CIA MJ-12 operation so that our legal government no longer has jurisdiction. Fortunately, Eisenhower had the forethought in order to set up an intelligence unit that if this group ever completely took over in the future, that they would come into operation. Everybody's familiar with this, only alert, knowledgeable citizenry can protect our future liberties and freedoms, and beware of the misplaced powers. And then you have Kennedy. He was denied access through assassination just 10 days after requesting MJ-12 information.
And it's very important. It was very specific. 10 days before he is shot and killed in Dallas, he had written a memo that has been released. We now have it. And that was directed to the director of the CIA to establish communication with the then Soviet Union about collaborating with the United States on a joint mission, Soviet Union, United States, going to the moon. And that was interpreted, as Jim Mars and I have concluded, and Daniel Liss and we've discussed this endlessly. If MJ-12 was organized by President Harry Truman in 1947, and the same moment he brought the Central Intelligence Agency into being, September 18th, 1947. MJ-12 was brought into being in a secret, classified, never seen executive order. That executive order defined all knowledge about extraterrestrial biological entities and an alien presence on this planet as a threat to national security, and used the words, "The public and the media are never to know at all costs." The at all costs legally gave the government of the United States the ability to have termination orders through MJ-12 of anyone who was threatening to expose the UFO ET presence to the public and the media. Therefore, an attorney said it could be argued that in 1963, November, when Kennedy ordered the CIA director who was head of MJ-12 to do a collaboration with the Soviet Union to go to the moon, knowing that there were non-humans on the moon, this would have violated the MJ-12 original Truman definition of a threat to national security, and that it could be argued it was a legal termination of the president who threatened national security.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was the infamous Allen Dulles, who he fired for his nefarious activities that he was doing, was replaced by John McCone, who, Kennedy gave the request to. Allen Dulles.
Dulles was still DCI. He was still in the number one in MJ-12, even when McCone took over the CIA.
Exactly. He was MJ-1, and he set up, from the Byrne memo, everybody's familiar with studies of stuff, that he set up an assassination directive, which, James Jesus Angleton, executed, and so Kennedy was denied access, and then you have, many years go by, 77, Carter, because he had a UFO experience and because it was one of his campaign promises to release the UFO files, he was denied access, as Daniel Sheehan, one of the 20 witnesses that was at the National Press Club, testified, that was denied by CIA Director George H.W. Bush. And then so you have another president being denied access, and then you have it goes along until 1993, where the what was it? The Rockefeller Initiative, where Lawrence is actually a little bit different than the rest of the Rockefellers, it seems, wanted to have disclosure. And as Bill Clinton famously said to Sarah McClendon, who was a nice little lady who sponsored the National Press Club event, regarding disclosing, he says, "Sarah, there's a secret government in the government, and I don't control it." And he had his CIA director, James Woolsey, try to gain access, and Dr. Greer had a meeting with him, brought a huge stack of papers validating because the CIA director is being denied access. He said, "I know the subject's real. I'm trying to figure out why the hell I can't gain access to it." Of course,
that was what Woolsey said, right?
Yeah, Woolsey wrote a letter afterward, kind of, doing a disclaimer, Dr. Greer is blowing it out of proportion, and everything. So Dr. Greer met with military advisors, and they decided to start this witness archival project. That's how I got involved, because they started collecting from 1993 to the year 2000, where I was the 100th videotape witness, but they had altogether about 450 military intelligence and some corporate witnesses. And it's interesting, that same year, 1993, I traveled to outside of Area 51. The first time Bob Lazar ever came public, there was a small group, about a dozen people outside of Area 51 in Rachel, and he gave 2 hours of his testimony, which no recording devices were allowed whatsoever, but I happened to have a video recorder going on my lap and got 2 hours, and I put it up on my site, thewebmatrix.net, and anybody can watch it. But it's just kind of interesting that all these people being denied access. And in 1996, the CIA director, William Colby, Dr. Greer had a meeting with, and he was planning on releasing a zero-point energy device along with $50 million to Dr. Greer in order to get it out to the world. And this was just before he was going to testify on the CIA's illegal operations on drug trafficking, child trafficking, human trafficking type of thing. But, he ended up floating face down in the Potomac River just before releasing all that information. And in 1997, Dr. Greer and Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, gave the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Tom Wilson, a list of these unacknowledged special access programs, which, as listeners know, that's where it doesn't matter who you are, you're not acknowledged that the program even exists. What's kind of interesting was when I met with Bob Lazar back in 93, before that, in 91, they had a meeting that was similar but without Lazar, and the base at Nellis Air Force Base put out an NRO classified advisory which listed, a distribution list saying that, anybody that interfaces with this, there's going to be disciplinary actions taken against it. They didn't want any of the base personnel to interface with, the people over at Rachel that were having this meeting. And so on this list there was distribution, cosmic ops, magi ops, all this. Anyway, this was the document that they presented to Admiral Tom Wilson. When he found out that those were real projects, he was denied access, and he says, well, the hell, I don't have access, I'm the head of intelligence. And so he said to Dr. Greer, he said, well, this is a quote, well, as far as I'm concerned, if you can get your people who know about this matter to talk on the record, you have my permission to go to the media with this. This group is illegal, quote unquote. And so, the first hour of the National Press Club was jammed by the NSA. They really didn't want people, the public, to know what was being disclosed. After, we were on all the major networks, which they did what they call as a limited hangout, the intelligence community, where all this information that I mentioned earlier was disclosed, what they did was they made it sound like, oh, they have a group of military and scientists. They want to have a congressional hearing into the reality of UFOs, which makes it sound like the government has better things to do than to do this. And so they effectively sanitized the message from the public from getting out there. I had no idea what when I went to testify, Linda, I had no idea what Operation Mockingbird was. I thought I was actually naively thinking this is going to be a world-changing event. Like, oh my God, we're going to release these technologies to the world. That we had anti-gravity back in the 50s, that we can get off of these dangerous, obsolete technologies.
Yeah. And you were not alone. In 2000 and before, I don't think that there would have been any average American citizen who had ever heard of Project Mockingbird. And I'm holding in my hand a page that was released by the Washington Post. And it says, secret eyes only at the top, all caps, with a black line through it, as if it was unclassified for the Washington Post to use. And it's Project Mockingbird. And the opening paragraph, Project Mockingbird, a telephone intercept activity, was conducted between March 12, 1963. This is before the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November, and June 15th, 1963, and targeted two Washington-based newsmen who at the time had been publishing news articles based on and frequently quoting classified materials of this agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and others, including top secret and special intelligence. This is one of over 690 pages in a report, of which this one page was released by the Washington Post. And when you go to Wikipedia today, it says, Operation Mockingbird was an alleged large-scale program of the United States Central Intelligence Agency that began in the early 1950s, not 1963. The document itself is trying to make it as if it only lasted a month. Not true. It was going on from the early 1950s into the 1970s. And that its goal, which we will talk about after this coming break in great depth through you, but the stated goal from the early 1950s onward was, quote, to attempt to manipulate news media for propaganda purposes. It funded student and cultural organizations and magazines as front organizations, and that means for the Central Intelligence Agency. And that this was the CIA, using counterintelligence methods, would camouflage themselves as being, let's say, a news operation, and everything was phony, and they were trying to block any legitimate news that was about UFOs, extraterrestrials, bases on the backside of the moon, bases in Antarctica, whatever was going on Mars, anything that was coming close to the truth of an alien presence on this planet, under the surface of this planet, throughout the solar system and beyond. Every single thing they were blocking, manipulating, and using the media itself, in ignorance, did not understand how the government was manipulating this concocted story at the time that there were no UFOs or ETs.
That's why we love KHERA.
Yes.
Yep, they're on perception management on steroids today. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it hasn't changed, has it?
It's only escalated and become more sophisticated.
Yeah, and under this administration, would you say that what would you say the definition of truth is?
The definition of truth. All I can say in this whole subject matter is you have to research, you have to look chronology, you have to look at history, you have to look at the documents, you have to look at the witnesses, and after you get so many indications, I mean, if 500 and some witnesses, admirals, generals, astronauts are all making this up, then we've got a really weird problem going on. But I would say absolute truth I don't know about, but there is a heck of a lot of indicators.
And after this break, when we come back, let's just go right as deep as you can go into Project Mockingbird and everything that you've learned as it has evolved from the